Racist police officers detain a black family on a long road trip, unaware that the father is a CIA agent. What happens when prejudice meets an unexpected truth? What started as a routine traffic stop quickly escalated into a dramatic confrontation, exposing the systemic injustices faced by countless individuals every day. Have you ever found yourself in a moment where injustice was glaringly obvious, or watched someone else experience it and felt unsure how to respond? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. The Carter family's road trip was meant to be a celebration, a well-earned reward for their eldest daughter, Sophia, who had just been accepted into Stanford University. It was the kind of milestone that marked a lifetime of hard work and dreams coming true. Her father, Michael Carter, was proud, though he expressed it with quiet dignity. He kept his focus on the road as the family SUV hummed along. In the passenger seat, Emily, his wife, flipped through their road trip playlist, debating with their son, Jack, about the best songs to set the mood. Sophia, seated in the back seat, grinned as she leaned against the window. She clutched her journal, still buzzing from the excitement of sharing the news with friends and family. Jack, the spirited 15-year-old, teased her about already planning her new college life, while he animatedly scrolled through his phone. The journey stretched through the vast landscapes of New Mexico, with rolling hills and sunlit mesas painting a picture-perfect backdrop. The road was quiet, just as Michael had hoped. He had insisted on taking the scenic route for a more peaceful drive. For now, everything felt right. Earlier in the day, the family had stopped at a small-town gas station to refuel. The town seemed ordinary enough, with a diner and a few shops dotting the main road. However, as Michael stepped out to fill the tank, he noticed the looks. A group of locals standing outside the convenience store cast sideways glances at their vehicle, a rented SUV with out-of-state plates. The whispers weren't subtle, nor was the disapproving shake of one man's head as he gestured toward the car. Inside the store, Emily grabbed water bottles and snacks, while the cashier, a middle-aged man with a faded baseball cap, eyed her coolly. As she approached the counter, he asked with a sharp tone, "Passing through or staying a while?" Emily smiled politely, trying to brush off the tension. "Just passing through," she replied lightly. "Well," the cashier drawled, scanning the items. "Folks here don't like strangers getting too comfortable." "Just saying." Emily froze for a moment but chose not to engage. She handed over the cash, grabbed the items, and quickly left. Outside, Michael had noticed the same energy. A man near the pump muttered something under his breath, loud enough to be heard but indistinct enough to avoid direct confrontation. When they pulled out of the gas station, Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Weird vibe, huh?" she murmured. Michael nodded, his jaw tight. Jack, oblivious, leaned forward from the back seat. "You guys are overthinking it. People here are probably just bored." Michael didn't answer. His instincts told him otherwise, though he kept his thoughts to himself. As the SUV continued its journey, the tension from the gas station began to dissipate. Sophia was now immersed in her journal, jotting down thoughts about Stanford. Jack was deep into his phone, laughing occasionally at memes he found funny enough to share with the group. Emily, ever the peacemaker, turned the volume up on the playlist. "Let's lighten the mood," she said, trying to bring the family's focus back to the joy of the trip. Michael glanced at her, offering a small smile. "We'll be in Santa Fe by dinner," he reassured her. The winding back road seemed endless, but Michael felt the quiet was worth it. He wanted this day to be memorable, especially for Sophia. His job as a government operative often required secrecy and long absences, but today, he was just Dad, determined to be fully present for his family. The countryside unfolded in golden hues, with mesas rising dramatically against the horizon. For a moment, everything felt tranquil. Even Emily, who had been fidgeting earlier, seemed more at ease, leaning back in her seat as the music played softly. Then, without warning, the tranquility shattered. In the rearview mirror, Michael spotted the red and blue lights of a patrol car flashing insistently behind them. His grip on the wheel tightened instinctively. "Why are they stopping us?" Emily asked, her voice sharp with unease. Michael's expression remained calm, though his mind raced. "I don't know," he said evenly, "but let's stay calm." The SUV slowed as he guided it onto the gravel shoulder of the road. The flashing lights painted the desert in an unsettling strobe of red and blue. "Is this about the gas station?" Jack asked from the back seat, his voice laced with nervous energy. "No," Michael replied firmly. "Just stay quiet, Jack." Sophia looked at her father, her wide eyes filled with questions she didn't voice. Emily placed a hand on her daughter's knee, a silent message to stay composed. Michael adjusted his rearview mirror, watching as two officers stepped out of the patrol car. Their movements were deliberate, almost rehearsed. One of them, a stocky man with mirrored sunglasses, placed his hand on his holstered gun as he approached. The other, taller and younger, surveyed the SUV like a predator circling its prey. Michael inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He reached for his wallet slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "Let's just cooperate," he said under his breath. His tone was calm, but there was a steel edge to it that his family didn't miss. Emily's hand tightened around the armrest as the officers drew closer. What began as a family celebration was now veering into the unknown, a moment that would change everything. The SUV idled on the gravel shoulder as Michael Carter kept his eyes locked on the rearview mirror. The two officers approached the car with deliberate steps, their demeanor oozing authority. "What is this about?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with unease. "Stay calm," Michael replied, his tone steady but clipped. He opened the driver's window and waited. Officer Barnes, the stockier of the two, reached the driver's side. His mirrored sunglasses reflected Michael's calm but guarded face. The officer's hand lingered on his holstered gun, a silent but clear message. "License and registration," Barnes barked, his voice curt and devoid of courtesy. Michael complied without hesitation, his movements slow and deliberate. He handed over his documents, his expression giving nothing away. "Mind telling me why you stopped us?" Michael asked evenly. Barnes ignored the question, flipping through the papers. Meanwhile, Officer Jenkins leaned down on the passenger side, peering into the car with sharp, probing eyes. "Where are you folks headed?" Jenkins asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. Michael answered calmly, "Santa Fe, family trip." Jenkins's gaze lingered on the back seat, where Jack and Sophia sat frozen. "Pretty fancy car for a little trip, isn't it?" "It's a rental," Michael said, keeping his voice level. Jenkins smirked, clearly unsatisfied. "And what's in the back? Drugs? Weapons? Something you don't want us to find?" Jack bristled at the insinuation. "It's just our luggage," he blurted out before Michael shot him a warning look. "Quiet, Jack," Michael said firmly, his eyes shifting back to Jenkins. "There's nothing illegal in this car." Emily couldn't stay silent any longer. "We haven't done anything wrong. Why are we being treated like criminals?" Barnes straightened up, his hand still resting on his belt. He leaned closer to Michael, his voice lowering but growing more menacing. "Tell your wife to keep quiet unless she wants me to find a reason to put her in cuffs." Emily's face flushed with anger, but Michael raised a hand to stop her from speaking further. "There's no need for threats," he said, his voice steady, but with an edge that hinted at his mounting frustration. Jenkins chuckled darkly. "This one thinks he's in charge," he muttered, almost as if speaking to himself. Barnes glanced back at Jenkins, then returned his focus to Michael. "Step out of the car, all of you." Michael frowned. "Is that really necessary?" "It wasn't a request," Barnes snapped. Emily looked at Michael, her worry evident. Sophia's hand gripped the seatbelt tightly, her knuckles white. Jack, wide-eyed, muttered under his breath, "This is ridiculous." Michael exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "Okay," he said calmly. "Everyone, let's just do what they say." The family exited the SUV, standing uneasily on the shoulder of the road as passing cars zoomed by. Barnes and Jenkins split up, circling the vehicle like sharks scenting blood. "Stand over there," Jenkins ordered, motioning toward a patch of gravel a few feet away. As the Carters moved, Barnes began rifling through the car without asking for permission. He tossed their carefully packed bags onto the ground, unzipping them with no regard for their contents. Clothes, books, and personal items spilled out haphazardly. "What the hell are you doing?" Emily asked, unable to hold back her outrage. Barnes didn't even glance her way. "Routine check," he said flatly, though his actions were anything but routine. Michael stepped forward slightly, his posture tense but controlled. "You're invading our privacy without cause. Do you have a warrant?" Jenkins strode over, cutting Michael off with a sneer. "A warrant? Out here, we don't need one to check out something that doesn't feel right. And you? Don't feel right." Sophia gasped. "You can't just say that." Barnes finally spoke up, tossing another bag aside as if it were trash. "We can say whatever we damn well please, little girl. Now keep your mouth shut before I lose my patience." Michael's composure slipped slightly. "That's enough," he said firmly, his voice dropping into a lower register. Jenkins squared up to Michael, his smirk fading into a glare. "You raising your voice at me?" Michael didn't flinch. "No, I'm standing up for my family." something you seem to have a problem with. The air between them grew thick with tension. Jenkins's hand moved toward his baton, but Barnes interrupted. Don't bother. They'll screw themselves over soon enough. Barnes pulled open the rear door of the SUV and grabbed a locked case. He rattled it, his curiosity clearly piqued. What's in here? Personal belongings, Michael answered. Open it, Barnes demanded. Michael shook his head. Not without a warrant. Barnes's face darkened. I can open it my damn self. He dropped the case onto the gravel and pulled at the latches, but they held firm. Barnes's frustration boiled over, and he yanked harder, eventually forcing the case open with a loud crack. Papers spilled out, scattering in the desert wind. That's enough, Emily shouted, stepping forward. Jenkins immediately moved to block her path. Ma'am, step back. Or what? Emily shot back. Or you're going to regret it, Jenkins snarled. Michael placed a hand on Emily's arm, gently pulling her back. His voice was calm but firm. Emily, don't. Let me handle this. Sophia, trembling with anger, stepped closer to her brother. This is insane, she whispered, her voice cracking. It's wrong, Jack replied quietly, clenching his fists. Barnes rifled through the spilled contents of the case, pulling out a stack of folders and flipping through them carelessly. Government stuff? He muttered with a raised brow. You some kind of big shot? Michael stepped forward, his patience wearing thin. Put those back. Now. Barnes smirked but complied, tossing the papers back into the case. He turned to Jenkins. I'm not buying this story. They don't belong here. Jenkins nodded in agreement, his gaze locked on Michael. Yeah, they're definitely hiding something. Sophia finally snapped. We're not hiding anything, you're just… Quiet, Barnes bellowed, cutting her off. Michael stepped between his daughter and the officer, his eyes cold and sharp. Don't raise your voice at her again. For a moment, no one moved. The standoff was palpable, like a rubber band stretched to its limit. Barnes took a step back, his lip curling into a sneer. You've got a lot of nerve. Michael didn't respond. His silence was more powerful than any retort. The tension had reached its peak, but the officers weren't finished. Their next demand would push the family even further into the unknown. The gravel crunched beneath their feet as the Carters stood beside the SUV, the dry desert wind brushing past them. Officer Barnes and Officer Jenkins wasted no time asserting their authority, their movements brisk and unapologetic. Step back, Barnes barked, motioning with a sharp flick of his wrist. We're going to have a look. You don't have a warrant, Michael said, his voice steady but edged with a quiet warning. Barnes shot him a cold glance. We don't need one. This is a routine stop. Without waiting for a reply, he yanked open the rear door and began rifling through their belongings. Jenkins moved to the passenger side, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the seats. He leaned in, pulling at the duffel bags and opening them without care. Clothes tumbled out onto the dusty ground, their bright colors stark against the dull earth. Sophia gasped. Hey, that's my stuff! Jenkins didn't even look at her. Quiet, he muttered dismissively, tossing aside her carefully packed textbooks. Michael took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. Enough, he said firmly. You're crossing a line. Barnes ignored him, now rummaging through a smaller bag filled with toiletries. Stay right where you are or we'll have a bigger problem, he said without looking up. Emily's voice broke through the rising tension. What are you looking for? Drugs? Guns? We've told you we're just a family on a road trip, Jenkins snorted, finally glancing at her. Funny how everyone's innocent until they aren't. As Barnes moved to the trunk, his eyes lit up with interest when he spotted a locked black case tucked neatly beneath the other bags. He hauled it out with a grunt, holding it up for everyone to see. What's in here? He asked, a note of challenge in his tone. Personal belongings, Michael replied calmly, though his eyes didn't leave the officer's hands. Open it, Barnes demanded. No, Michael said firmly. You have no right to search it without a warrant. That case contains private, professional documents. Barnes raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a smirk. Professional, huh? Sounds like something worth hiding. Jenkins stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. What kind of documents? He asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Michael didn't flinch. That's none of your concern. Barnes's smirk faded, replaced by a hardened glare. Oh, I think it is. With that, he turned the case on its side and began pulling at the latches. Stop! Michael barked, stepping forward. You're violating our rights! Barnes didn't stop. He yanked harder, and with a sharp crack, the lock broke. The lid sprang open, and papers spilled out, scattering in the wind. Emily's shout pierced the air. You have no right to do that! Barnes chuckled darkly. stooping to gather the papers. If there's nothing to hide, then why worry? That's enough. Michael's voice was louder now, commanding attention. He stepped between Barnes and the scattered papers, his jaw tight. Jenkins moved quickly, his hand on his baton. Back off, he warned. Sophia's voice trembled with anger. This isn't right. You're treating us like criminals. Jack, standing beside her, clenched his fists. This is insane. You're trashing our stuff for no reason. Barnes stood, brushing the dirt off his hands. Watch your tone, kid, he sneered. You don't want to make things worse. Emily wasn't backing down. Worse? You've already destroyed our property, humiliated us, and invaded our privacy. How much worse can it get? Jenkins took a step toward her, his eyes narrowing. Ma'am, I suggest you calm down. Or what? Emily fired back, her voice trembling but defiant. Michael raised a hand, signaling for Emily to stop. Don't engage, he said quietly, though his own restraint was wearing thin. Barnes, now visibly irritated, tossed the remaining papers back into the broken case. You're awfully protective of these documents, he said, his tone accusatory. Makes me think there's more to this little family trip than you're letting on. Michael's eyes locked onto Barnes's. You're fishing, and you know it. Barnes smirked, unbothered by the accusation. Maybe I'm just doing my job. Sophia bent down to pick up one of her textbooks that had been thrown aside. Her hands shook as she held it close to her chest. Why are you doing this? She asked softly, her voice cracking. Jenkins glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Just following protocol, he muttered, though even he seemed to falter under her gaze. Jack, emboldened by his sister's courage, stepped closer to Michael. Dad, they're not going to stop. They're just trying to scare us. Michael's jaw tightened. He knew Jack was right, but he also knew that any sudden moves could escalate the situation further. Emily, however, was done holding back. She took a step toward Barnes, her voice rising. You're harassing us. You know damn well there's nothing illegal here. Barnes turned to face her fully, his hand resting on his holstered gun. Take another step, and I'll make sure you regret it, he said coldly. Michael immediately stepped between them, his voice low and firm. That's enough. If you want to escalate this, you're making the biggest mistake of your career. Barnes and Jenkins exchanged a glance, the tension between them evident. Michael turned to Emily, his tone softening. Pick up what you can and stay close to the kids. Then, addressing the officers, his voice hardened again. You've made your point. Now back off. Barnes laughed, a short, humorless sound. My point? Oh, we're just getting started. Jenkins hesitated, looking at the broken lock and scattered papers. Maybe we should call it, he said quietly, though Barnes shot him a glare. We call it when I say so, Barnes snapped. Michael stood his ground, his eyes unflinching as they locked onto Barnes's. You're crossing into dangerous territory, he said. You're not going to find what you're looking for because there's nothing to find. Barnes opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, the tension was broken by the sound of a car horn. A vehicle slowed down, its driver craning their neck to see what was happening. The momentary distraction seemed to give Jenkins pause. This isn't over, Barnes muttered, stepping back. The officer's aggression had pushed the Carters to their limit, but Michael knew this was far from the end. The situation was about to spiral even further. Jack's hands trembled as he slid his phone out of his pocket, tapping the screen to start recording. He positioned the camera toward Jenkins, who was still rummaging through their belongings. The officer carelessly tossed clothes and books onto the ground, showing no regard for the family's personal property. What are you doing? Jack called out, his voice cracking slightly but loud enough to draw attention. Barnes, who had been standing near the trunk, immediately turned, his eyes narrowing. Put that away, he ordered, his tone sharp and unyielding. Jack didn't flinch. I'm recording this. You can't stop me. Barnes's jaw tightened as he marched toward Jack, his boots crunching against the gravel. Give me the phone, he demanded, extending his hand. No, Jack replied defiantly, clutching the device tighter. In a flash, Barnes grabbed Jack's wrist and ripped the phone from his grasp. Before anyone could react, he hurled it to the ground with a forceful swing, the phone shattering into pieces against the hard concrete. Hey! Jack yelled, stepping forward instinctively. Back off, kid, Barnes growled, his face flushed with anger. Michael was already moving before Barnes could say another word. He stepped between the officer and his son, his posture firm, his tone cutting. That's enough. Barnes squared his shoulders, standing toe-to-toe with Michael. You want to make this worse, pal? Michael didn't blink. You've already crossed the line, destroying his phone, harassing my family. You're the one making this worse. Without warning, Barnes shoved Michael backward with both hands, forcing him to take a step back to steady himself. Step away, or I'll arrest you for obstruction, Barnes snarled, his hand now hovering over his baton. Michael held his ground, his voice low and deliberate. Touch me again, and you'll regret it. Emily rushed forward, trying to defuse the situation. Stop it! This is out of control. We haven't done anything wrong. Jenkins, now watching the scene unfold, quickly moved to intercept her. He grabbed her arm, forcing her to stop in her tracks. Stay back, he snapped, his grip tightening. Let me go, Emily shouted, struggling against his hold. Sophia, tears streaming down her face, screamed, Get your hands off my mom! The sound of her daughter's voice seemed to snap Emily out of her shock. She wrenched her arm free, glaring at Jenkins with pure rage. Don't touch me again, she hissed, her voice trembling but fierce. Jenkins stepped back slightly, raising his hands mockingly. Relax, lady. You don't want to end up in cuffs. Sophia clung to Emily, her sobs muffled against her mother's shoulder. Jack, still fuming, bent down to pick up the pieces of his broken phone. You can't just destroy my stuff, he shouted, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. Barnes sneered, his lip curling. You should have kept it in your pocket, kid. Actions have consequences. Michael's patience was wearing dangerously thin. He turned his focus back to Barnes, his voice sharp and commanding. We're done with this. You've gone far enough. Barnes didn't back down. I'll decide when we're done. Jenkins, emboldened by Barnes's aggression, moved closer to Michael. You think you can call the shots here? He taunted. Michael stood tall, his fists clenched at his sides. I'm telling you to stop now before this gets out of hand. Barnes laughed, a short, harsh sound. Out of hand? You're the one escalating this. Maybe it's time we put you in cuffs and taught you a little respect. Barnes reached for his handcuffs, but before he could act, Michael took a deliberate step forward. His tone dropped into a quiet, deadly calm. Try it. See how that works out for you. The two men locked eyes, the tension between them thick and electric. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably but didn't step in. Emily pulled Sophia and Jack closer, her eyes darting between Michael and the officers. This is insane, she muttered under her breath. Sophia whispered, Dad, please. Her voice cracked with desperation. Michael glanced over his shoulder at his family, his expression softening for just a moment. Then he turned back to Barnes, his demeanor hardening again. You've done enough damage. Let us go, or I'll make sure you regret this. Barnes smirked, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Big talk. Got anything to back it up? Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, his unwavering gaze boring into the officer. The weight of his confidence made Barnes hesitate. Jenkins finally broke the stalemate. Barnes, maybe we should call it. This is getting messy. Barnes glared at him, but the hesitation was clear. He glanced back at Michael, his hand still hovering near his baton. Fine, he muttered reluctantly. But don't think this is over. The officers stepped back, though their expressions remained hostile. Michael exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He turned to his family, his voice low and steady. Are you all okay? Emily nodded shakily. Sophia wiped her tears, and Jack clutched the broken pieces of his phone, his jaw set in silent fury. This isn't right, Jack muttered. They can't just get away with this. They won't, Michael promised, his tone firm. Emily looked at him, her eyes searching his face. What do we do now? Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned back to the officers, his expression unreadable. We're not done here, he said softly, almost to himself. Michael's stance was firm, his jaw tight with controlled fury as he stepped closer to the officers. His eyes locked onto Barnes, his voice cutting through the tension. You've crossed the line, he said, his words sharp and deliberate. Barnes didn't flinch. If anything, his smirk grew wider, his arrogance palpable. The only line crossed here is yours, he retorted, his hand still hovering over his baton. Michael took a breath, his calm exterior belying the storm brewing beneath. Enough of this, he said, his tone low but commanding. Sophia clutched Emily's arm, her voice a whisper. "What's Dad doing?" Emily didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on Michael, the tension in his body unmistakable. Michael's hand moved deliberately to the inside pocket of his jacket. Jenkins stiffened, his hand darting toward his holster. "What are you reaching for?" Jenkins barked, his voice sharp with suspicion. Michael's movements remained slow, calculated. "Something that will clarify things," he replied evenly. With a flick of his wrist, Michael pulled out a slim black wallet. He flipped it open, revealing the unmistakable glint of a gold badge. The bold lettering next to the emblem read, "Central Intelligence Agency." For a moment, silence fell over the scene. The once smug expression on Barnes's face faltered as his eyes darted between the badge and Michael's unyielding stare. Jenkins took a step back, his hand dropping from his holster. "Your CIA?" Jenkins asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael's reply was ice cold. "That's right. And what you're doing here, it's not just wrong, it's criminal." Barnes recovered quickly, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. "CIA? So what?" he sneered, trying to mask his unease. "You think that badge makes you untouchable?" Michael didn't blink. "No, it doesn't," he said calmly. "But it does give me the power to hold people like you accountable for abusing yours." Barnes bristled, his smirk returning in a forced attempt at confidence. "Big talk, but you're still standing on the side of the road like everyone else. Your badge doesn't change the fact that you're out of place here." Michael stepped closer, the intensity in his gaze making Barnes falter. "That badge represents a level of authority you clearly don't understand. And right now, I'm telling you, walk away or face the consequences." Jenkins's voice cut through the tension, shaky but attempting to remain firm. "We didn't know. If we had—" Michael raised a hand, silencing him. "You didn't care," he said bluntly. "You saw a family you thought you could intimidate, and you acted without reason. This isn't about not knowing. It's about your assumptions." Barnes tried to regain control, his voice rising. "We're just doing our job. If you've got nothing to hide, there shouldn't be a problem." Michael's patience snapped. "Don't give me that 'just doing your job' excuse," he said, his voice cutting like a blade. "Destroying a kid's phone, harassing a mother, tossing personal belongings onto the ground like trash? That's not your job. That's a power trip." Emily stepped forward, emboldened by Michael's unwavering stance. "You've traumatized my kids, destroyed our property, and violated our rights. And for what? Because we don't look like we belong?" Sophia, her voice trembling but determined, added, "You thought you could bully us because we wouldn't fight back. You were wrong." Jenkins glanced at Barnes, the weight of their actions clearly sinking in. "Maybe we should—" Barnes cut him off with a glare. "No, we're not backing down." Michael's voice dropped, deadly serious. "This is your last warning. Stop now, or you'll be explaining this to your superiors. And to mine." For the first time, Barnes hesitated. His bravado wavered as he looked at Michael's badge again, its significance impossible to ignore. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably, his confidence eroding under the weight of Michael's unrelenting gaze. "You're bluffing," Barnes said finally, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Michael didn't move, his expression unreadable. "Try me." The silence stretched, the power dynamic shifting completely. Barnes's hand dropped from his belt, though his jaw remained clenched. "This doesn't mean anything," Barnes muttered, though even he seemed to know the words rang hollow. "Oh, it means a lot," Michael countered. "It means I have the training, the resources, and the authority to ensure you're held accountable. And trust me, I will." Jenkins finally broke. "Let's just call it," he said quietly, his voice almost pleading. Barnes glared at him, but didn't argue. He turned back to Michael, his face a mask of frustration and barely concealed fear. "This isn't over," Barnes said through gritted teeth. Michael didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "For your sake, I hope it is." Barnes and Jenkins exchanged a glance, their earlier bravado now fully deflated. They stepped away from the SUV, their retreat signaling the end of their immediate aggression. Michael turned back to his family, his expression softening slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone steady but tinged with concern. Emily nodded, her hand resting on Sophia's shoulder. Jack held up the shattered remains of his phone, his jaw tight. "What now?" he asked, his voice low. Michael glanced at the officers, who were now standing by their patrol car, speaking in hushed tones. "Now," he said, his voice firm, "we make sure they don't get away with this." Michael's voice cut through the thick tension like a blade. "Call your superior, now." Barnes's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He glanced at Jenkins, who hesitated before grabbing his radio. "Lieutenant Hale, we need you at our location," Jenkins muttered into the receiver, his voice subdued. Michael stood tall, his expression unyielding as the officers avoided his gaze. Emily and the kids remained close, watching the scene with a mix of fear and quiet resolve. Meanwhile, passing cars began to slow, curious drivers craning their necks to see what was happening. Within minutes, a small crowd began to gather on the side of the road. Phones were raised, their cameras aimed squarely at the officers and the Carters. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. "What's going on?" "Looks like trouble." "Did you see the badge? CIA?" Michael ignored the murmurs, keeping his focus squarely on Barnes and Jenkins. "I hope your lieutenant has more sense than the two of you," he said coldly. A black SUV pulled up, its arrival heralded by the crunch of tires on gravel. A tall man in his late 40s stepped out, his uniform crisp and his expression unreadable. Lieutenant Hale surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, his gaze lingering on the scattered belongings and the tense faces of both the family and his officers. "Who called me out here?" Hale demanded, his voice calm but authoritative. Jenkins stepped forward quickly, eager to defend himself. "Sir, we were conducting a routine stop when—" Michael cut him off sharply. "Routine? Destroying property, harassing my family, and violating our rights? That's routine for you?" Hale's eyes flicked to Michael, taking in his stance and the badge still visible in his hand. "And you are?" Michael stepped closer, his voice firm. "Michael Carter, CIA. And I have every intention of making sure what's happened here is addressed at the highest level." Barnes scoffed softly, but Hale raised a hand, silencing him. "Let's all take a step back," Hale said, his tone measured. "Mr. Carter, I understand you're upset, but my officers were just doing their job." Michael's eyes narrowed. "If this is your definition of doing their job, then we have a serious problem." Michael gestured to the shattered remains of Jack's phone on the ground. "Your officer destroyed that without cause," he said, his voice rising slightly. "They rifled through our belongings, broke into a locked case, and manhandled my wife. And for what? Because we don't look like we belong here?" Hale's jaw tightened as murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Phones continued to record, the scene quickly becoming a public spectacle. "I have evidence," Michael continued, his tone sharp. "Some of the footage is still recoverable, and I have witnesses. Your actions are being documented as we speak." He gestured toward the growing crowd. Hale exhaled, clearly calculating his next move. "Mr. Carter, if mistakes were made, I assure you they'll be addressed internally." "Internally?" Michael repeated, his voice laced with disdain. "You think I'm going to trust you to handle this quietly? No. Either you take responsibility here and now, or I escalate this to federal oversight. Your choice." The weight of the situation became undeniable as the murmurs from the crowd turned into outright questions. "Why are they harassing a family? Did you see the kid's phone? It's smashed." "Someone should call the news." Hale glanced at the onlookers, his expression tightening. The phones pointed in his direction weren't just a nuisance. They were a liability. His tone shifted slightly, becoming less defensive. "Mr. Carter, I hear you," he said carefully. "And I assure you, this will be taken seriously." "Then start now," Michael replied, his voice unrelenting. "I want both of them relieved of duty immediately." Barnes bristled. "Sir, we were just—" "Enough," Hale snapped, his composure cracking for the first time. He turned to Barnes and Jenkins, his tone cold. "You're done here. Return to the station and wait for further instructions." "But, Lieutenant," Barnes began, only to be silenced by Hale's glare. "Now," Hale ordered. With visible reluctance, Barnes and Jenkins retreated to their patrol car, their earlier bravado replaced by quiet humiliation. As the officers drove away, Hale turned back to Michael. "I'll ensure a full investigation is conducted." "You have my word." Michael didn't budge. "Your word isn't enough. I expect transparency, accountability, and restitution for the damage they've caused. Hale nodded curtly. Understood. Emily stepped forward, her voice firm despite the lingering tremor. And what about my kids? How do you plan to fix the trauma they just endured? Hale hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Ma'am, I'll do everything in my power to ensure justice is served. Michael studied Hale for a moment before speaking again. I'll be following up. You can count on that. Hale gave a stiff nod before returning to his SUV, his demeanor still tightly controlled. The lieutenant may have temporarily diffused the situation, but the weight of what had occurred hung heavily in the air. As Hale's SUV disappeared down the road, Emily turned to Michael. Do you think they'll actually do anything? Michael's expression was grim. Not unless we make them. Sophia wiped her eyes, her voice quiet but resolute. Dad, people are watching. This isn't just about us anymore. Michael glanced at the crowd, many of whom were still filming or talking amongst themselves. He nodded slowly. You're right, he said. This is just the beginning. While the officers were temporarily removed, Michael knew the fight for justice was far from over. Their next steps would determine whether this was a moment of accountability or just another case swept under the rug. The video didn't take long to go viral. Uploaded by a bystander who had recorded the confrontation, it spread across social media platforms like wildfire. The footage captured the shattered phone, the scattered belongings, and the raw anger on the faces of both the Carters and the officers. Michael's calm, yet authoritative demeanor as he displayed his CIA badge was the moment that sealed the video's impact. It wasn't just a clip, it was evidence, and it struck a nerve. Within hours, hashtags like "High Justice for the Carters" and "High's Abuse of Power" began trending. Comments poured in, reflecting a stark divide in public opinion. This is disgusting. Those officers need to be fired immediately. They were just doing their job. The family overreacted. Why was the CIA guy so defensive? Feels like he's hiding something. This happens to people of color every day. Glad someone caught it on tape. Some users demanded swift accountability, sharing similar stories of harassment by law enforcement. Others rallied behind the officers, claiming they had acted appropriately given the suspicious circumstances. News outlets picked up the story, further fueling the debate. Headlines ranged from "CIA agent confronts rogue officers" to "routine traffic stop sparks national outrage." Back in the small town where the incident occurred, the reaction was immediate and visceral. A group of residents, outraged by the video, gathered outside the police department, holding signs that read, "Justice for the Carters" and "End police abuse." "We can't let this slide," a woman in the crowd said into a reporter's microphone. If this can happen to a CIA agent and his family, what chance does an ordinary person have? Among the protesters was a young man who had witnessed the stop firsthand. "I saw how those officers treated them," he told the cameras. "It wasn't right. They didn't deserve that." Inside the department, however, the atmosphere was tense. Officers muttered amongst themselves, angry at what they perceived as a betrayal by the community. "They're making us out to be the bad guys," one officer grumbled, all because of a video taken out of context. The division was clear. Not everyone in the town supported the protests. Another group gathered on the opposite side of the street, holding signs like "Support our officers" and "Police lives matter." One man, wearing a hat emblazoned with the town's name, shouted at the protesters across the street. "You don't know the whole story. Those officers risk their lives every day to keep us safe." His words were met with boos and jeers, but he pressed on. What if that family was hiding something? The cops were just doing their job. The verbal clash between the two groups grew heated, and at one point, a protester yelled back, "Doing their job doesn't mean violating people's rights." The police department, caught in the middle, issued a vague statement, promising an internal investigation while also defending the integrity of their officers. As the story gained traction, Michael and Emily decided it was time to address the growing public interest. Standing before a small gathering of reporters outside their hotel, they spoke candidly about their experience. "We were treated like criminals for no reason," Emily began, her voice steady but firm. "My children watched as their belongings were thrown onto the ground, as their father was threatened, and as their trust in law enforcement was shattered." Michael stepped forward, his tone calm yet resolute. "This isn't just about us. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. It's about holding those in power accountable, whether they wear a badge or not. Reporters bombarded them with questions. Do you think this would have happened if you weren't a CIA agent? What message do you have for the officers involved? Do you plan to take legal action? Michael's answers were measured but pointed. Yes, we're pursuing every avenue to ensure justice is served. This isn't about vengeance, it's about change. Inspired by the Carters' bravery, local activists began organizing. A town hall meeting was called, where residents demanded answers from the police chief. Why weren't these officers suspended immediately? One man asked, his voice echoing in the crowded room. The chief, clearly under pressure, tried to maintain composure. We are conducting a thorough review of the incident. I ask for your patience as we gather all the facts. Patience? A woman shot back. We've been patient for years. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, and you know it. The tension in the room was palpable, with voices overlapping as frustration boiled over. The small gathering outside the police department swelled into a full-blown protest over the following days. People from neighboring towns joined in, bringing signs, megaphones, and unwavering determination. We're here to make sure they hear us, one protester declared, her voice amplified by a bullhorn. This isn't just about one family. This is about all of us. The protests remained peaceful, but the message was loud and clear. The community demanded accountability, and they wouldn't be silenced. Meanwhile, online petitions calling for the termination of Barnes and Jenkins gained tens of thousands of signatures. Messages of solidarity poured in from across the country, turning the local incident into a national conversation. Despite the overwhelming support for the Carters, the backlash against them was equally fierce. Online forums lit up with conspiracy theories, accusing Michael of pulling rank to avoid scrutiny, or suggesting that the family had fabricated parts of the story. You don't just pull out a CIA badge unless you're hiding something, one commenter wrote. Others targeted Emily and the kids, accusing them of overreacting or playing the victim. Michael addressed the criticism in a brief statement. We've been transparent from the beginning. If anyone believes this story is exaggerated, I encourage them to look at the evidence for themselves. As the protests continued and media coverage intensified, pressure mounted on the local police department to act. Internal sources revealed that the department had received calls from state and federal officials, urging them to take the matter seriously. The police chief, feeling the weight of both public scrutiny and higher authorities, announced a press conference. We are committed to ensuring justice is served, he said, though his words were met with skepticism. What began as a roadside confrontation had now become a rallying cry. The Carters' ordeal was no longer just their fight. It was a symbol of systemic issues that resonated far beyond the small town. People began sharing their own stories of unjust treatment by law enforcement, using the Carters' story as a platform to demand change. Towns across the state organized their own protests, and civil rights organizations reached out to support the family. The outpouring of support transformed the Carters' story into a social movement, one that demanded accountability and justice, not just for them, but for everyone who had experienced abuse of power. The Carters weren't going to let what happened fade into the background. The time for silence had passed, and their fight for justice began with action. Michael and Emily sat across from their lawyer, Rachel Torres, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for tackling high-profile civil rights cases. Rachel wasted no time as she laid out their options. This isn't just a case of harassment, Rachel said, flipping through the documentation Emily had painstakingly compiled. We're looking at destruction of property, unlawful search, excessive force, and racial profiling. This has federal lawsuit written all over it. Emily nodded, her determination clear. We want accountability. We want them held responsible for what they did to our kids, to our family. Michael leaned forward, his voice calm but resolute. And we want this to be a warning. No one else should have to go through this. Rachel met his gaze. Then we go public. Press conferences, interviews, the works. The more people see the truth, the harder it'll be for them to sweep this under the rug. Meanwhile, Sophia and Jack began sharing their story with local and national media outlets. At first, they were hesitant. Sophia hated the spotlight, and Jack was still processing the anger and fear he felt during the incident. But they both knew this wasn't just about them anymore. In an emotional interview with a local news station, Sophia recounted how she felt watching her father stand against the officers. "I've never been more scared in my life," she said, her voice trembling. "They treated us like we were less than human. We didn't matter. But my dad didn't back down. He showed them we did matter." Jack, sitting beside her, added, "It wasn't just about the phone they smashed. It was about how powerless they made us feel. That's what needs to change." The interview went viral, amplifying the already intense public reaction. Support poured in from all over the country, but so did the backlash. "They're exploiting their kids for sympathy," one critic commented online. "They're just trying to cash in on a lawsuit," another claimed. Sophia responded during a follow-up interview. "This isn't about money. It's about making sure people in power don't abuse it. If you think standing up for what's right is exploitation, maybe you need to rethink your priorities." Michael, accompanied by Rachel, representatives from a prominent human rights organization, and a small group of reporters, returned to the small town where the incident had occurred. Their goal was clear: ensure transparency and accountability from the local police department. As they arrived at the police station, the tension was palpable. Protesters still lingered outside, some holding signs demanding justice for the Carters, while others shouted slogans in support of the police. Inside, Michael and his team met with Police Chief Warren, a man who looked every bit as uncomfortable as he was defensive. "We're conducting a full internal review," Warren began, his tone carefully measured. "The officers involved have been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome." Michael didn't bother hiding his skepticism. "Administrative leave? That's a slap on the wrist. These men violated the law and you're letting them sit at home with pay?" Rachel interjected, her tone sharp. "Chief Warren, we're not here to hear excuses. We're here to demand transparency. That means a public apology, disciplinary action, and a commitment to reform." Warren bristled. "This is a complex situation. You have to understand what I understand." Michael cut in, his voice like steel, "is that my children were traumatized. My property was destroyed, and my rights were violated. And so far, all I've seen is a department trying to protect its own." The room fell silent. Rachel leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Warren's. "You have a choice. Work with us to fix this, or we escalate. And trust me, you don't want to see what escalation looks like." As the legal and civil rights teams dug deeper, more troubling information came to light. Barnes and Jenkins had prior complaints of misconduct filed against them. Complaints that had been quietly dismissed by the department. Rachel held a folder thick with documents as she addressed the media later that day. "This isn't an isolated incident. This is a pattern of behavior that's been ignored for far too long. And the Carters are standing up not just for themselves, but for everyone who's been silenced by this system." The crowd of reporters erupted into questions, but Rachel raised a hand to quiet them. "No further comments for now. The evidence speaks for itself." Back in the town, the divide deepened. A small but vocal group of residents gathered outside the police department, accusing the Carters of dragging their community through the mud. "They don't even live here," one man shouted during a heated argument with a protester. "They're blowing this out of proportion and making us all look bad." The protester, a young woman holding a sign that read "Justice for All," fired back, "If you're more worried about your town's reputation than the truth, you're part of the problem." The tension threatened to spill over into physical confrontations more than once, but both sides managed to keep things from escalating further. Despite the mounting backlash, Michael refused to back down. In a meeting with civil rights leaders, he spoke candidly about the challenges ahead. "We knew this wouldn't be easy," he said. "The system is designed to protect itself. But if we don't fight now, nothing will ever change." Emily, sitting beside him, nodded. "This isn't just about what happened to us. It's about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Their words resonated with the room, solidifying their allies' commitment to the cause. The Carters' fight began to take on a life of its own. Civil rights organizations organized rallies in major cities, using their story as a call to action. Lawmakers began drafting proposals for police reform, citing the Carters' case as evidence of the urgent need for change. Even as the opposition grew louder, with critics accusing the family of seeking fame, the Carters stayed focused. We don't want fame, Michael said in yet another interview. We want justice, and we're not stopping until we get it. The Carters had turned their personal fight into a national movement, one that shined a light on the systemic failures they and so many others had endured. As the Carters' fight for justice gained momentum, so did the resistance against them. While supporters rallied to their side, others, angry and emboldened, pushed back with vitriol. In the town where the incident occurred, a group of residents gathered outside the police department with signs that read, "Support our officers," and "Stop the smears." Their chants echoed through the streets. "The Carters are blowing this way out of proportion," one man yelled into a megaphone. "These officers were just doing their job." Others nodded in agreement, shouting slogans like, "Protect our police," and "Don't let outsiders tear us apart." Emily watched a live stream of the protest from their hotel room, her hands clenched into fists. "They're making us the villains," she said, her voice tight with frustration. Michael stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "They're afraid," he said simply. "Afraid of what this means for their status quo." Jack, sitting cross-legged on the bed, looked up. "It's not fair. We're just trying to tell the truth." Michael turned to his son, his expression calm but resolute. "The truth scares people, Jack. That's why we have to keep pushing." The backlash wasn't limited to public demonstrations. One morning, Michael opened his email to find a message with the subject line, "You're next." The body of the email was short and chilling. "If you know what's good for you, you'll drop this. Families like yours don't belong here." Emily froze when Michael showed her the email. "This is serious," she said. "We need to tell someone." Michael nodded. "We will. But this isn't going to stop me." Later that evening, a plain white envelope arrived at their hotel. Inside was a single piece of paper with crude handwriting. "Go home before it's too late." Sophia's face paled as Michael showed the note to her and Jack. "Dad, what if they mean it? What if they actually try something?" Michael knelt in front of her, his voice steady. "Sophia, threats are a tool of fear. They want us to back down because they know we're making a difference. That's why we can't stop." Jack clenched his jaw. "We need to fight harder." Michael placed a hand on his shoulder. But we'll do it the right way." The threat soon turned physical. One night, as the family returned to their hotel after a meeting with their lawyers, they found a small group of protesters waiting near the parking lot. "Go back to where you came from," a man yelled, his face twisted in anger. "Stop ruining our town," another shouted. Emily tightened her grip on Sophia's hand. Jack moved closer to Michael, his body tense. Michael stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We're not here to ruin anything. We're here to make sure the law applies to everyone, including those who wear a badge." The crowd jeered, their anger rising. One man stepped closer, his finger jabbing toward Michael's chest. "You think you're a hero? You're just another outsider trying to stir up trouble." Michael didn't flinch. "If holding people accountable for breaking the law is stirring up trouble, then yes, I am." The tension crackled like a live wire. Finally, one of the hotel security guards intervened, stepping between Michael and the protester. "You all need to leave," the guard said firmly. "This is private property." Grudgingly, the protesters dispersed, but not before one of them muttered, "This isn't over." Inside the hotel room, Emily paced back and forth, her frustration spilling over. "They're trying to intimidate us at every turn. How are we supposed to stay strong when it feels like the whole town is against us?" Michael placed a hand on her shoulder, stopping her. "Because we're not alone," he said. "For every protester out there, there are 10 more people who believe in what we're doing. The noise is loud, but it's not the majority." Sophia, still shaken, spoke up. "What if they do something worse next time? What if they actually hurt someone?" Michael knelt in front of her, his voice soft but unwavering. "Sophia, we don't let fear dictate our actions. If we stop now, we're letting them win. And I'm not about to let that happen." The family's resolve deepened with every challenge they faced. Michael reached out to their legal and human rights teams, ensuring they had all the support they needed to continue the fight. "We need to turn their tactics against them," Rachel said during a strategy meeting. "If they want to intimidate, we'll make it public. Every threat, every attempt to silence you, we use it to show the world what's at stake." Michael agreed. No more playing defense. It's time to go on the offensive. Emily added, "We have to make it clear. We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for everyone who's ever been silenced." As the Carters doubled down on their efforts, the community's response began to shift. Local activists organized a counter-protest to support the family, gathering outside the police department with signs that read, "End police abuse" and "Justice for the Carters." One of the organizers, a young woman named Leah, spoke passionately into a megaphone. "The Carters didn't come here to destroy this town. They came here to expose the truth. And if we don't stand with them, we're complicit in letting this system continue unchecked." The growing support emboldened the Carters. Michael spoke at one of the rallies, addressing the crowd with a mix of gratitude and determination. "This fight isn't just about my family," he said. "It's about every family that's been told their rights don't matter. It's about ensuring that power is held accountable, no matter who wields it." The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy rekindling the Carters' hope. Despite the threats, the protests, and the backlash, the Carters pressed on. Michael's calm resolve became a symbol of strength for those who believed in their cause. "They can yell, they can threaten, they can try to intimidate us," Michael said during an interview. "But every time they do, it only reinforces that we're on the right side of this fight." The Carters made their intentions clear. They were not backing down. With their legal team and civil rights advocates by their side, the family held a press conference to lay bare the evidence of what had transpired. Michael stood at the podium, flanked by Emily, Sophia, Jack, and their attorney, Rachel Torres. Behind them, a large screen displayed images of the destroyed phone, the scattered belongings, and still frames from the viral video that had ignited a national conversation. Rachel began, "Today, we are here to expose the truth about the abuse of power and the violations suffered by the Carter family at the hands of Officers Barnes and Jenkins." Her voice was steady, but the conviction behind it was unmissable. "This is not just about one family. This is about holding law enforcement accountable to the very laws they are sworn to uphold." Michael took the microphone next, his tone calm yet charged with purpose. "What happened to my family was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper problem within a system that allows unchecked authority to go unpunished. We have the evidence to prove it, and we will not be silenced." Emily stepped forward, holding up a bag containing the shattered remains of Jack's phone. "This was destroyed without cause," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "But the real damage was done to my children's sense of safety and trust. No family should ever have to experience this." Sophia and Jack shared their perspectives, their voices raw but resolute. Jack spoke directly to the cameras. "We're not just fighting for our family. We're fighting for every kid who's ever been told their voice doesn't matter." The presentation concluded with Rachel revealing a file of prior complaints against Barnes and Jenkins, detailing a troubling pattern of misconduct. These officers were protected by a system that prioritized loyalty over accountability. "That ends now," she declared. The press conference sent shockwaves through the media. News outlets dissected every piece of evidence, and social media exploded with reactions. "This family is so brave for standing up. Why weren't these officers held accountable before? Now, they're just playing victim for attention. The system is broken, and it's time to fix it." While the support was overwhelming, the backlash was equally fierce. Opponents accused the Carters of waging a smear campaign against law enforcement. One pundit on a conservative news program argued, "This is an attack on all police officers, not just the two involved." But the Carters weren't deterred. "Let them talk," Michael said during an interview. "Their noise only highlights how uncomfortable the truth makes them." In the days following the press conference, civil rights organizations organized a massive rally in the town where the incident occurred. Hundreds of people marched through the streets, holding signs that read, "Justice for the Carters," "End police abuse," and "Accountability now." At the rally's peak, Leah, a local activist who had been among the first to support the Carters, delivered a powerful speech. "This isn't just about one family. It's about every family that's been failed by a system designed to protect those in power," she said, her voice ringing through the crowd. The protests were peaceful but firm, their message clear. The time for change had come. As the rally reached its conclusion, a group of protesters gathered outside the police department, demanding answers. Police Chief Warren emerged briefly to address the crowd, flanked by a row of officers. "We hear your concerns," Warren said, his voice strained. "We are conducting a thorough investigation and will take appropriate action once it's complete." But the crowd wasn't satisfied. Shouts of "when" and "how much longer" rang out. Someone yelled, "It's been weeks, and you've done nothing." The tension was palpable, but Warren held his ground. "This is a complex situation. We ask for your patience." Rachel, who was present at the rally, wasn't buying it. Turning to a group of reporters nearby, she stated, "They're stalling, hoping this will blow over. We won't let that happen." Rachel and her team filed a formal lawsuit against the police department, citing multiple violations of civil rights laws. The suit called for disciplinary action against Barnes and Jenkins, as well as systemic reforms to prevent future abuses. "This lawsuit isn't just about punishment," Rachel explained to the press. "It's about change, ensuring that the system works for everyone, not just those in power." The announcement of the lawsuit drew even more national attention. Prominent public figures voiced their support for the Carters, while others criticized the move as unnecessary and divisive. Privately, Michael and Emily discussed the growing strain on their family. The public attention was taking its toll, particularly on Sophia and Jack. "I hate that they're being dragged through this," Emily admitted one night. "They're just kids. They're strong," Michael replied, though the worry in his eyes betrayed him. "But you're right. We need to protect them as much as we can." Still, they both knew there was no turning back. The ripple effects of the Carters' fight were felt far beyond their immediate surroundings. Inspired by their courage, other families began coming forward with their own stories of police misconduct. A father from a neighboring town shared how his son had been wrongfully detained for hours without cause. A young woman recounted being harassed during a routine traffic stop. Their voices added fuel to a growing movement, one that demanded not just accountability for Barnes and Jenkins, but broader reforms to the system itself. As pressure mounted, the police department announced that both officers would face disciplinary hearings. While it wasn't the full accountability the Carters had hoped for, it was a step in the right direction. Michael addressed the development during an interview. "This is a small victory, but the fight isn't over. We're not just here for justice in our case. We're here to make sure no one else has to go through this." The Carters' fight became a symbol of resistance against abuse of power, galvanizing communities across the country. Rallies were held in major cities, and lawmakers began drafting proposals for police reform, citing the Carters' story as a turning point. Emily summed it up best during a televised interview. "We started this fight because of what happened to us, but it's grown into something much bigger. This isn't just about one family. It's about a system that needs to change." The news broke quietly, but spread like wildfire. Officers Barnes and Jenkins had been placed on indefinite suspension and were now the subjects of a federal investigation. The announcement, delivered during a hastily arranged press conference, was met with mixed reactions. "For too long, officers have operated without accountability," a spokesperson for the Department of Justice stated. "This investigation will ensure that justice is served and that such actions do not go unchecked." For the Carter family, it was a small but significant victory. "It's a start," Michael told a reporter, "but this isn't the end. Accountability isn't just about punishing individuals. It's about fixing the system that allowed them to act this way in the first place." The suspension of Barnes and Jenkins sent a clear message, but it also reignited tensions within the small town. Supporters of the officers organized a rally, chanting slogans like "Protect our police" and "No justice for liars." One local business owner voiced his anger on camera. "These men were just doing their jobs. Now their careers are ruined because some outsiders wanted attention." But others welcomed the news. Leah, the young activist who had become a key figure in the protests, called it a step toward progress. "This investigation shows that change is possible," she said. "But we can't stop here. This is bigger than two officers. It's about the entire system." The Carters weren't content to watch from the sidelines. Each family member found a way to contribute to the growing movement for justice and reform. Sophia, still grappling with the trauma of the incident, channeled her anger into activism. At Stanford, she joined a student-led organization focused on social justice and police reform. Her voice, once hesitant, grew stronger with every speech she gave. "We can't afford to stay silent," Sophia told a crowd during her first campus rally. "What happened to my family was wrong, but it's not unique. This fight isn't just about us. It's about making sure no one else has to live through it." Meanwhile, Jack launched a digital project aimed at amplifying the voices of those who had experienced police misconduct. With help from friends and supporters, he created an online platform where people could share their stories anonymously. "People need to know they're not alone," Jack explained during an interview. "Change starts with awareness. If we can shine a light on these issues, we can start to fix them." The platform quickly gained traction, with stories pouring in from across the country. Each post added fuel to the growing movement, reminding the Carters that their fight was far from isolated. Michael, with his experience and connections, became a key advocate for systemic change. He met with lawmakers, civil rights leaders, and community organizers, using his platform to push for tangible reforms. Body cameras, independent oversight, better training. These aren't just buzzwords, Michael said during a roundtable discussion. They're necessary steps to ensure transparency and accountability. Rachel Torres, the Carters' attorney, worked alongside Michael to draft a proposal for statewide police reform. Together, they presented it to legislators, urging them to take immediate action. Back in the small town where it all began, the suspension of Barnes and Jenkins began to shift public opinion. For some, the investigation was a wake-up call. "I didn't want to believe it at first," one resident admitted during a town hall meeting. "But after seeing the evidence, I can't ignore the fact that something has to change." Others remained defiant. "This whole thing has been blown out of proportion," a man declared angrily. "The Carters got what they wanted. Why can't they just move on?" Leah, who attended the meeting, wasn't having it. "Moving on means ignoring the problem," she countered. "And that's what got us here in the first place." The divide within the town mirrored the broader national conversation, with opinions polarized and emotions running high. As the investigation into Barnes and Jenkins continued, the Carters began to see signs that their efforts were making an impact. Several police departments across the state announced new policies aimed at preventing abuse of power. These included mandatory body cameras, de-escalation training, and increased transparency in disciplinary actions. Civil rights organizations reported a surge in calls from individuals seeking help with cases of police misconduct. Many credited the Carters' story for inspiring them to come forward. "This is what change looks like," Rachel said during a meeting with the family. "It's slow and it's messy, but it's happening." One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table for the first time in weeks, Emily took a moment to reflect on how far they'd come. "This isn't the life I imagined for us," she admitted. "But I'm proud of what we've done, of what we're still doing." Sophia nodded. "It feels like we're actually making a difference." Jack, ever the realist, added, "But there's still so much to do." Michael, looking at each of them in turn, said, "That's the thing about change. It's never complete. But every step we take gets us closer to where we need to be." The Carters' fight had grown into something far larger than themselves. Their story became a rallying cry for those demanding justice, their resilience a source of inspiration for countless others. But Michael knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. As he sat down to prepare for another round of meetings and interviews, he reminded himself why they had started this journey in the first place. Change doesn't happen overnight, he thought. But it starts with people who refuse to give up. The Carter family's fight for justice culminated in a community event held in the town where their ordeal began. The gathering, organized with the help of local activists and civil rights groups, was more than just a rally. It was a call for unity and change. The community center buzzed with activity as people from all walks of life filled the space. Some came to show solidarity, others to listen and learn. The Carters stood together near the stage, greeting attendees and sharing quiet moments of reflection before the event began. When the time came, Michael stepped onto the stage. The crowd quieted, their attention drawn to the man who had become a symbol of resilience. "Thank you all for being here," Michael began, his voice steady but warm. "This isn't just about my family's story. It's about all of us. About creating a world where fairness and accountability aren't just ideals, but realities." He paused, scanning the crowd. "We've been through a lot," he admitted. There were moments when it felt easier to give up, to let fear win. But standing here today, seeing all of you, I'm reminded why we kept going. Sophia joined her father on stage, gripping the microphone tightly as she addressed the audience. "When this all started, I didn't think I could handle it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was scared, angry. I didn't want to talk about what happened because I didn't think it would make a difference." She looked out at the crowd, her confidence growing. "But I was wrong. Speaking up does matter. Every voice matters. And if we keep standing together, we can change things, not just for us, but for everyone." The applause was deafening, and as Sophia stepped back, she caught her father's proud smile. Next, Jack approached the microphone, his demeanor serious. "I started a project to collect stories from people who've been through things like my family has," he said. "At first I thought I'd get a few responses, but now there are hundreds of stories. People who've never been heard, finally getting the chance to speak up." He paused, his tone sharpening. "We can't stop here. Sharing stories is just the beginning. We need to make sure those stories lead to action." The audience erupted in cheers, many nodding in agreement. The event continued with speeches from local activists, human rights advocates, and even a few residents who had initially been skeptical of the Carters but had since come around. Leah, the young activist who had supported the Carters from the beginning, delivered one of the most powerful statements of the day. "This family didn't just fight for themselves," she said. "They fought for all of us, and now it's up to us to keep the momentum going. This is our town, our community, and it's our responsibility to make it better." The crowd responded with a standing ovation, their energy palpable. As the event wound down, the Carters found a moment to themselves backstage. Emily hugged Sophia tightly, her eyes filled with pride. "You were amazing up there," she said. Sophia smiled. "It felt good. Maybe we're actually making a difference." Jack, ever pragmatic, added, "We've still got a lot of work to do." Michael placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "And we'll do it together." He pulled his family into a hug, his voice soft but firm. "We've been through so much, but we're stronger because of it. And the future will be better, not just for us, but for everyone we've helped along the way." In the weeks following the event, the impact of the Carters' efforts became even more evident. State lawmakers passed new legislation mandating body cameras and independent oversight for all law enforcement agencies. Civil rights organizations reported an increase in community engagement, with more people stepping forward to demand accountability. Sophia's student organization gained national recognition, while Jack's digital platform continued to grow, becoming a hub for stories and resources related to police reform. Michael and Emily remained active advocates, attending rallies, meeting with policymakers, and mentoring other families who had experienced injustice. One final interview brought the Carters' journey into focus. Sitting together in their living room, Michael addressed the camera directly. "Our story isn't unique," he said. "What happened to us happens to so many people every day. The difference is, we were lucky enough to have support, to have our voices amplified. But not everyone gets that chance. That's why this fight matters." Emily added, "Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with people who care enough to take a stand. And that's what we've learned. Every voice, every action, every small step can lead to something bigger." Sophia smiled. "We've seen what can happen when people come together. It's not perfect, but it's progress. And that's enough to keep going." The Carters' story became a beacon of hope for countless others. Their fight wasn't over, but they had shown that change was possible, that courage and unity could triumph over fear and injustice. What would you do if faced with a moment of injustice? Would you speak out or let it pass? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If this story inspired you, don't forget to share and subscribe to our channel for more real stories that challenge, empower, and ignite change. Together we can make a difference, one voice at a time.
The morning sun filtered through the sprawling oaks lining Riverside Estates, casting a golden glow over the pristine neighborhood. It was the kind of place where lawns were perfectly manicured, SUVs gleamed in driveways, and porch flags proclaimed allegiance to both the American dream and an unspoken exclusivity. Officer Bradley Cooper adjusted his sunglasses, gripping the steering wheel of his patrol car as he scanned the streets. Quiet as a church, just how I like it, Bradley muttered, the slight southern twang in his voice giving his words a sharper edge. Next to him, Officer Ethan Miller stared out the window, his expression uneasy. Ethan was new, fresh out of the academy, with a badge that still shone too brightly. His training officer, Bradley, was a department legend in Charleston's Riverside precinct, though not always for the right reasons. "Don't let the silence fool you," Bradley said, breaking the quiet. "These types of neighborhoods, full of snakes in suits, sneaking around, thinking they can outsmart the law. You see something out of place, you call it out." "Got it." Ethan nodded but stayed quiet, hoping the day would pass without incident. As they rounded the corner, a sleek black Mercedes-Benz pulled up to the driveway of a modern glass-front home. The man stepping out of the car caught Bradley's attention immediately. Tall, black, wearing a tailored gray suit that fit him like a second skin. He moved with an effortless confidence, holding a leather briefcase in one hand. Bradley narrowed his eyes. "Now, tell me that doesn't look suspicious." Ethan hesitated. "I mean, it's just a guy parking in his driveway. Maybe he—" "No, maybe, rookie," Bradley interrupted, slowing the car to a crawl. "Trust me, this doesn't sit right. Let's check it out." The patrol car came to a stop, and Bradley stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached the man. Ethan reluctantly followed, feeling the weight of dread settling in his stomach. The man, now halfway to the front door, turned to face them. His expression was calm, his brow slightly furrowed, as if he already knew what was coming. "Good morning, officers," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Morning," Bradley replied curtly. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" The man raised an eyebrow, glancing at the car and then back at Bradley. "I'm sorry. Is there a problem?" "Just answering a question would be a good start." Bradley shot back, his hand resting on his holster. "Do you live here?" The man sighed quietly and shook his head. "No, I'm here for a meeting with the homeowner." He reached into his pocket slowly and retrieved a set of keys, holding them up. "These were left for me in the mailbox. I was given permission to enter." Ethan cleared his throat. Maybe you should let me handle this," Bradley snapped, silencing his partner. "Got ID on you?" Bradley asked, his voice sharp. The man nodded and pulled out his wallet. "Here you go. Nathaniel Brooks. You'll see everything's in order." Bradley snatched the ID, holding it up to the sunlight as if he were inspecting a counterfeit bill. "HM, fancy name, fancy suit, fancy car. That's a lot of fancy for someone just visiting. You sure this isn't your way of casing the joint?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but his composure didn't break. "I assure you, officer, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "That's so," Bradley said, his tone dripping with disbelief. "Well, how about you prove it? Registration for the car? Meeting details? Or do we just skip to the part where you come down to the station?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "Bradley, maybe we should." "Rookie, zip it," Bradley barked, turning his full attention back to Nathaniel. "Here's the deal. We've got a nice neighborhood here, and your story just doesn't sit right with me. So, how about you stop with the attitude and cooperate?" Nathaniel straightened, his calm voice now tinged with steel. "Officer, I've been nothing but cooperative. What you're doing is profiling. Plain and simple." Bradley's face darkened. "Profiling? That's a big word for someone about to ride in the back of a squad car. Turn around, hands behind your back." Ethan stepped forward. "Bradley, come on, this isn't—" "Step back, Miller," Bradley barked. Nathaniel didn't resist as Bradley slapped the cuffs on him, though the humiliation was written all over his face. The crisp white of his shirt contrasted sharply with the cold metal around his wrists. "This is absurd," Nathaniel said, his voice still calm but laced with frustration. "I have the keys. I've given you identification. There's nothing here to justify this." "Tell it to the judge," Bradley sneered, gripping Nathaniel's arm and leading him to the patrol car. Ethan, helpless, climbed back into the passenger seat. The silence during the drive to the station was suffocating. Bradley whistled as if it were just another routine day. At the Riverside Police Precinct, the humiliation only worsened. Nathaniel was processed like any other suspect. Mugshot taken, pockets emptied, and his personal belongings cataloged. The officers on duty exchanged smirks as they watched. "Got ourselves a real Wall Street type," one officer said, eyeing Nathaniel's briefcase. Tom Jenkins, a loud and abrasive officer known for his crass humor, chuckled as he examined Nathaniel's suit. This guy came dressed to impress. What did you think? You were heading to a job interview. Hate to break it to you, pal, but orange is your color now. Nathaniel met Tom's gaze, his expression unwavering. I suggest you tread carefully, officer. You're out of your depth. Tom laughed, slapping his knee. Oh, he's got jokes. Look at this one, Bradley. Bradley joined in, smirking. Yeah, he thinks he's somebody important. Well, we'll see about that once we run his name. Meanwhile, Ethan sat at his desk, staring at the confiscated items laid out before him. Among them was a sleek leather wallet containing a gold embossed card. His curiosity got the better of him, and he flipped it over. Nathaniel Brooks, Chief of Police, South Carolina State Police. Ethan's blood ran cold. His heart raced as he checked the name against the database. There it was, clear as day. Nathaniel Brooks was indeed the newly appointed Chief of Police for the state. Swallowing hard, Ethan rushed to Bradley, holding up the card. Bradley, we messed up. Big time. Bradley took the card, glanced at it, and laughed. Oh, come on. You think this guy is a state chief of police? What? He printed this at Kinko's. Bradley, it's in the system, Ethan insisted. He's legit. We arrested the chief of police. Bradley's smirk faltered. No way. As the realization began to dawn on the precinct, the laughter stopped. Officers exchanged uneasy glances. Martha Reynolds, the precinct's senior sergeant, stormed into the room, keys jangling in her hand. Where is he? She demanded. In the cell, Ethan said, his voice trembling. Martha marched to the holding area and unlocked the door. Nathaniel stepped out, his suit wrinkled but his dignity intact. His eyes swept over the room, landing on each officer who had mocked him. The silence was deafening as Nathaniel straightened his tie and said in a calm, cutting voice, Gentlemen, you've just made the mistake of your careers. The room felt like it had been vacuum sealed. Every officer frozen in place as the realization of their mistakes settled over them. Nathaniel Brooks stood at the center of it all, a calm but commanding presence. His suit, once immaculate, now bore the faint creases of the holding cell. Yet he still managed to exude authority. Martha Reynolds, visibly shaken, had positioned herself between Nathaniel and the other officers, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She knew damage control was a futile effort at this point, but she had to try. Chief Brooks, she began, her voice faltering. I deeply regret. Stop, Nathaniel said, raising a hand. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to silence the entire room. Save your apologies, Sergeant Reynolds. They're not for me. They're for the badge you all wear. The officers who had been mocking him minutes earlier now avoided his gaze, their faces red with embarrassment. Bradley stood near the doorway, his arms crossed tightly, his jaw set in defiance. He didn't look humiliated, he looked angry. Nathaniel took a step forward, addressing the room as a whole. You think I don't know what's happening here? That I haven't seen this play out 100 times before? A black man in a nice car, wearing a nice suit, and suddenly he doesn't belong. Suddenly, he's a criminal. Ethan, seated at his desk, felt his chest tighten. The weight of Nathaniel's words was unbearable because they were true. He hadn't stopped Bradley. He hadn't done anything to prevent this disaster. Nathaniel turned his sharp gaze to Bradley, who still hadn't moved. Officer Cooper, isn't it? I'd like to hear your explanation. What was it about me that made you so sure I was guilty? Was it the suit? The car? Or just the fact that I didn't match your idea of who belongs in that neighborhood? Bradley didn't flinch. I did my job, sir. That's all there is to it. If you hadn't acted suspicious... Suspicious? Nathaniel interrupted, his voice rising just enough to cut through the room like a knife. Walking to a front door with keys in my hand is suspicious to you? Carrying identification and cooperating with every one of your ridiculous demands is suspicious. Bradley opened his mouth to respond, but Nathaniel wasn't done. Do you know what I see when I look at you, Officer Cooper? I see a man who hides his prejudice behind his badge. You don't enforce the law, you enforce your bias. And today, you decided to humiliate the wrong person. Bradley's face darkened, but he didn't respond. The silence that followed was suffocating. Nathaniel turned to Martha. Sergeant, I want a meeting with every officer in this precinct. Now, Martha nodded quickly, already moving to gather the staff. Yes, Chief Brooks. Right away. The precinct's conference room was a small, outdated space with mismatched chairs and a coffee machine that rarely worked. But now, it was packed wall to wall with officers, every one of them looking as though they'd rather be anywhere else. Bradley sat at the back, his arms still crossed, while Ethan hovered near the door, unsure whether he should even be in the room. Nathaniel stood at the front, hands resting on the table. His calm demeanor had returned, but the edge in his voice hadn't softened. Let me make one thing clear, he began, scanning the room. I didn't come here to be humiliated. I came here to do my job, a job I've worked damn hard to earn. And what did I get in return? Cuffs on my wrists and racist jokes at my expense. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke. Nathaniel continued, his voice growing stronger. What happened today isn't about me. This is bigger than me. This is about the culture that allows officers like Cooper to assume guilt based on nothing more than skin color. It's about the rest of you standing by, laughing, instead of speaking up. And it's about a system that protects bad cops instead of holding them accountable. He turned his attention to Ethan, who flinched under his gaze. And then there's you, the rookie. You saw what was happening, didn't you? You knew it wasn't right. Ethan swallowed hard. I tried to say something, but I didn't. You didn't try hard enough. Nathaniel cut in, his tone unforgiving. Do you know what's worse than an officer like Cooper? An officer who knows better but stays silent. Ethan's face burned with shame. Nathaniel took a deep breath, his anger simmering into something colder and more deliberate. I've seen this system from every angle. I've been stopped, searched, and humiliated more times than I can count. And I know that what happened to me today happens to black men and women across this country every single day. People without badges, without titles, without the privilege of being able to expose it the way I can. Bradley finally spoke up, his voice full of disdain. Look, with all due respect, Chief, you're blowing this out of proportion. We're just doing our jobs. If you've got a problem with how I handle mine, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here. The room went dead silent. All eyes turned to Nathaniel, who stared at Bradley for a long moment before speaking. You're right about one thing, Cooper, he said evenly. I do have a problem with how you handle your job, and I can promise you that problem is going to be addressed. But let me be perfectly clear. You're the one who doesn't belong here. You don't belong in a system that's supposed to serve and protect everyone, not just the people you deem worthy. Bradley smirked, leaning back in his chair. We'll see about that. Nathaniel didn't react. Instead, he turned to Martha. Sergeant Reynolds, I want a full review of today's incident. Every action, every word, every officer involved. And I want it on my desk by tomorrow morning. Martha nodded stiffly. Understood, Chief. Nathaniel's gaze swept over the room one last time. To the rest of you, if you think this is just another incident that's going to get swept under the rug, think again. Change is coming to this precinct, to this department. And I suggest you decide now whether you're part of the solution or a part of the problem. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving the room in stunned silence. Ethan found himself lingering in the hallway after the meeting, his mind racing. He felt torn between the ideals that had led him to join the force and the reality he'd witnessed today. Nathaniel's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Officer Miller. Ethan turned to see Nathaniel standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "Sir," Ethan stammered, unsure of what to say. Nathaniel studied him for a moment before speaking. "You have potential, Miller, but potential means nothing without courage. Remember that?" Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, sir." Nathaniel gave him a final, piercing look before walking away, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. Back in the squad room, Bradley was already venting to Tom. "He thinks he can come in here and lecture us like we're kids. Screw that. I've been on this job 20 years. I'm not taking orders from someone who doesn't even know how we do things here." Tom chuckled, slapping Bradley on the back. "Don't sweat it. Guys like that, they make a lot of noise, but they don't last long. You'll see." But as Bradley leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, he couldn't shake the feeling that this time he might have underestimated the fight ahead. The morning after Nathaniel Brooks's forced detainment, the entire precinct felt like it was holding its breath. The news had already spread like wildfire, not only within the department, but across the entire city of Charleston. By 9 a.m., the local news was running the story. New state police chief arrested by his own officers. Allegations of racial profiling surface. Nathaniel's face, stoic and composed as always, was plastered across the front page of every major news outlet in the area. Social media buzzed with outrage, both from supporters and critics. Back at the Riverside precinct, things were quieter than usual. Officers shuffled through their duties, their movements mechanical. Tension hung in the air like smoke, and no one dared to speak out of turn. Even the usual banter between officers felt forced and strained. The gravity of what had happened the day before lingered like a shadow over everyone in the building. Bradley Cooper sat at his desk, his fingers drumming against the surface as he stared at the computer screen. The familiar rhythm of his daily routine had been shattered. He had seen the headlines. He knew what the public was thinking. He had been here for 2 decades, long enough to understand how quickly things could spiral out of control. And this was spiraling. Bradley had always believed that the system, the badge, and the authority it carried had a certain unquestionable power. But Nathaniel's calm, calculated rebuke today, before it had shaken him to the core. The sting of being exposed in front of his peers still burned in his chest. Ethan Miller, on the other hand, was struggling with an entirely different set of questions. He had spent the entire night replaying the events over and over in his mind. Could he have done more when he saw Nathaniel being treated like a criminal? Should he have stood up to Bradley, even if it meant defying his mentor? Was he complicit simply because he stayed silent? The young officer had no answers, only a gnawing feeling that he was part of the very system he had sworn to protect. It was in this quiet, tense atmosphere that Nathaniel entered the precinct later that morning. His presence alone seemed to change the energy in the room. He didn't walk into the building with the same loud authority that some might expect from a man in his position. Instead, he was composed, almost somber, as if he had a purpose far beyond the one anyone else could see. The officers who were present at the arrest the previous day, Bradley, Tom Jenkins, and several others, shifted uncomfortably as Nathaniel approached the front desk. His voice was calm, but the weight of it reverberated through the room. "I need to speak with everyone involved in yesterday's incident." Immediately, Bradley stood up quickly, his palms pressed flat against the desk. "You've made your point, Chief. There's no need for this." Nathaniel turned to him slowly, his eyes cold, but there was no anger in his gaze. There was only the promise of something far more dangerous: accountability. "I'm not here to argue, Officer Cooper," Nathaniel said softly. "I'm here to do my job." With that, he moved toward the conference room, signaling for Bradley, Tom, and the others to follow. The tension that followed in the hallways was palpable, as if everyone knew that the next few minutes would decide the course of the department's future. The conference room was stiflingly quiet as the officers filed in one by one. Ethan took a seat in the back, his gaze drifting to the floor. He couldn't bring himself to look at anyone, especially not Bradley. He was still trying to reconcile the mentor he had admired with the man who had made a mockery of the badge he wore. Once everyone was seated, Nathaniel stood at the head of the table, his posture straight and unwavering. He looked each officer in the eye before speaking, his words measured but firm. What happened yesterday wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of a deeper issue that has been allowed to fester for too long. He paused for a moment, letting his words settle in. You see, I don't care about your intentions, Cooper. I care about the impact of your actions. Bradley opened his mouth to respond, but Nathaniel held up a hand to silence him. You had every opportunity to do things right, every opportunity to approach me with professionalism, but instead, you chose to treat me as a threat. Why? Because I didn't fit the mold you're so comfortable with. Because I wasn't white, wealthy, or, God forbid, one of you. Ethan could feel the heat rising in his chest, the guilt gnawing at him again. But Nathaniel wasn't finished. The truth is, this happens all over the country. Black men and women are treated as criminals before they even open their mouths. And what's worse, it happens within the very institution that's supposed to protect them. The irony isn't lost on me, but I'm not here for irony. I'm here to make sure this never happens again. Bradley's face tightened. We were just doing our job. There was nothing racial about it. Nathaniel's laugh was cold, devoid of humor. You think you weren't being racist? You think you can treat a man like that, based on the color of his skin and the car he drives, and not be part of the problem? A few of the officers shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke up. I'm not here to get into semantics, Nathaniel continued. I'm here to change the culture, and if you're not willing to change, then you can leave. Today, the room was dead silent. Nathaniel's gaze swept over every officer present, the weight of his words pressing down like an anchor. The tension was suffocating, and for the first time, Bradley looked uncertain. You can start by telling me the truth, Cooper. You're going to sit here and tell me you didn't know what you were doing? That you didn't know you were wrong? Nathaniel's voice was quiet but unyielding. Bradley swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he looked away, the guilt creeping in like a shadow. Tom Jenkins, ever the opportunist, cleared his throat. Look, Chief, we didn't mean to cross any lines. It was just a mistake. We've all made mistakes. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he looked like a man who had seen the same excuse too many times. Mistakes, he repeated. You call racial profiling a mistake? Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the reckoning he had been waiting for. Nathaniel was taking them to task, calling out everything that had been left unspoken for far too long. This isn't just about a single incident, Nathaniel said, his tone growing colder. This is about a system that has allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked. A system that tells people like me we don't belong. A few officers shuffled in their seats, the weight of his words sinking in. Nathaniel wasn't speaking just to Bradley anymore. He was speaking to all of them. I'll be conducting a full review of this department. Every officer will undergo bias training, and those who are unwilling to confront their own prejudices will find themselves out of a job. I don't care who they are. Bradley's jaw clenched. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but the room was too heavy with Nathaniel's resolve. His words hung in the air like a sentence, one that couldn't be ignored. Finally, Nathaniel addressed the room one last time. This is your last chance. You either stand with me in making this department better, or you stand against it. And if you choose the latter, don't expect me to turn a blind eye. As Nathaniel turned to leave, there was no cheering, no fanfare, just a quiet, unsettling realization that this was only the beginning. The precinct was a simmering pressure cooker, in the days following Nathaniel Brooks's intervention. The silence that had settled after his speech was replaced by murmurs in the hallways, whispered conversations behind closed doors, and nervous glances exchanged between officers who suddenly felt exposed. The weight of his promise, that things would change and swiftly, hung over everyone. Bradley Cooper had retreated into a corner of the break room, where he sat nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His usual bravado had dulled. It wasn't just the humiliation of being called out by Nathaniel in front of his peers. It was a growing realization that his actions had brought unwanted scrutiny to the department. He could feel it everywhere, in the awkward avoidance of his colleagues, the cautious tone of their conversations, and the sudden absence of Tom Jenkins, who had taken sick leave to avoid the fallout. Ethan Miller walked past the break room and paused, hesitating. He hadn't spoken to Bradley since the day of Nathaniel's arrest. Part of him didn't want to. He felt sickened by the way Bradley had handled the situation. But another part of him, still clinging to his rookie instincts, wanted to understand. Ethan stepped inside, clearing his throat. "Officer Cooper." Bradley glanced up, his expression guarded. "What do you want, rookie?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably, but he pressed on. "I want to ask, do you think what we did was right?" Bradley leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth twitching in something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're still green, kid. You don't get it yet. Right or wrong doesn't matter when you're out there. What matters is control. You lose control of a situation. You lose everything. That wasn't control," Ethan said, his voice firmer than he expected. "That was harassment. We treated him like a criminal when we had no reason to. And now the whole department is under fire because of it." Bradley's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. "Watch yourself, Miller. You think you're above this? You're just as much a part of the system as I am. Don't act like you're clean when you didn't say a damn word to stop it." Ethan flinched at the accusation, but Bradley wasn't wrong. The shame was a constant weight on his shoulders. Still, he couldn't ignore the growing voice in his head telling him that something had to change. "You're right," Ethan admitted quietly. "I should have spoken up. I didn't, and I regret it. But you didn't even question yourself, did you? You just assumed he didn't belong." Bradley's face hardened. "Get out, Miller." Ethan stared at him for a moment longer before turning and leaving the room. He didn't know what he had expected, a confession? A moment of reflection? Whatever it was, it hadn't come. Meanwhile, Nathaniel Brooks was in his temporary office on the second floor, reviewing the department's personnel files. The deeper he dug, the more frustrated he became. Complaints of misconduct, ranging from excessive force to discriminatory behavior, were buried under mountains of bureaucracy. Officers like Bradley and Tom had multiple infractions on their records, but none of them had led to meaningful consequences. Martha Reynolds entered the room, carrying a folder under her arm. "Chief Brooks," she said, her tone professional but tinged with unease. "I thought you want to see this." Nathaniel gestured for her to sit. She placed a folder on the desk and opened it, revealing documents related to Bradley Cooper's tenure. "I've been going through his record," Martha said. "He's been with us for nearly 20 years. Most of it's clean on the surface, but if you look closer..." Nathaniel scanned the papers, his eyes narrowing as he read. Bradley had been involved in multiple incidents that raised red flags, unnecessary stops, aggressive behavior during routine patrols, and even a formal complaint of racial bias from a black resident 5 years earlier. The complaint had been dismissed, labeled as unsubstantiated. "This isn't just a one-off issue," Nathaniel said, his voice tight with anger. "It's a pattern, and the department let it slide." Martha nodded, though her expression betrayed her discomfort. "Chief, I need to be honest. I've worked with Bradley for years. He's not a bad cop, but he's stubborn. He thinks he knows what's best, and sometimes that blinds him. But I also know he's not going to change unless he's forced to." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "Then it's time we force him. The question is, how far do we push?" Martha hesitated, What are you thinking? Nathaniel's expression hardened. We start by holding him accountable, and then we use this as a case study to overhaul the entire precinct. Later that afternoon, Nathaniel called a second meeting, this time with a smaller group. The officers most directly involved in the arrest, including Bradley, Ethan, and Martha. The atmosphere was tense as they gathered in the same conference room, the echoes of Nathaniel's previous speech still fresh in everyone's minds. Nathaniel began without preamble. I've reviewed the reports. I've reviewed your records. And I've come to a conclusion. This department has failed to hold itself accountable. That changes today. Bradley bristled. With all due respect, Chief, you're blowing this out of proportion. One incident doesn't define a department. One incident. Nathaniel repeated, his tone icy. You think this is just about what happened to me? This is about every complaint that's been ignored, every resident who's been harassed, every officer who stood by and did nothing. He turned to Ethan. Officer Miller, you said you regretted staying silent. Why didn't you speak up? Ethan's throat tightened, but he forced himself to answer. I was scared. Scared of stepping out of line, of going against my training officer. Nathaniel nodded. That fear is part of the problem. No officer should feel like they have to choose between doing what's right and keeping their job. That's what needs to change. He looked at Bradley next. As for you, Officer Cooper, your record speaks for itself. You've been given chance after chance to correct your behavior, and you've ignored every one of them. So now, I'm giving you an ultimatum. Either you agree to undergo mandatory bias training and accept a formal reprimand, or you step down. The room was silent. Bradley's jaw tightened, his pride visibly warring with his survival instincts. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and bitter. Fine, I'll take your damn training, but don't expect me to grovel. Nathaniel's expression didn't waver. I don't care if you grovel, Cooper. I care that you learn, because if this happens again, you won't get another chance. By the end of the day, the precinct felt like a different place. Nathaniel's decisive actions had sent a clear message. The old ways of doing things were no longer acceptable. Some officers resented him for it. Others respected him. But no one doubted that he meant every word he said. Ethan left the building that evening feeling a strange mix of relief and determination. For the first time, he felt like he had a choice, a real choice, to be part of the change Nathaniel was trying to create. As he walked to his car, he saw Nathaniel standing by his own vehicle, gazing out at the city skyline. Ethan hesitated, then approached him. Chief Brooks, he said quietly. Nathaniel turned, his expression softening slightly. Miller, what is it? Ethan shifted his weight, unsure how to begin. I want to do better. I want to be better. And I don't know how yet, but I'm willing to learn. Nathaniel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. That's a good start, Miller. Just remember, being better isn't a one-time decision. It's a choice you make every day. Ethan nodded, his chest feeling a little lighter. As he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were finally moving in the right direction. 2 weeks after the events that shook the Riverside Police Precinct, the department looked and felt different. The hallways were quieter, the air heavier with the weight of reflection and change. Officers who had laughed at Nathaniel Brooks now avoided eye contact whenever he passed. Those who had remained silent during his mistreatment found themselves questioning their own roles in perpetuating a broken system. Nathaniel had wasted no time implementing reforms. Mandatory bias training had begun for every officer, and complaints previously brushed aside were reopened and investigated. A community oversight board was established, consisting of local leaders and residents, to review incidents of misconduct and ensure transparency. The precinct was no longer insulated from accountability, and everyone felt the shift. Bradley Cooper, once the department's untouchable veteran, had become a ghost of his former self. Stripped of his usual bravado, he attended the bias training sessions, sitting in the back with his arms crossed, his face a mask of irritation. But as the sessions progressed, something began to change. The stories shared by community members during the training, stories of fear, humiliation, and distrust, started to chip away at the wall he had built around himself. One day, during a particularly intense session, a local black pastor named Reverend Gaines shared his story. "I was 15 the first time I was put in handcuffs," Reverend Gaines said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I was walking home from church, wearing my Sunday best. A cop stopped me, said I looked out of place. I'll never forget the look in his eyes. He wasn't looking at a kid. He was looking at a suspect. And that's all I've ever been to men like him. A suspect." Bradley's jaw tightened as he listened, his fingers gripping the edge of the chair. He wanted to look away, to dismiss the man's words as exaggeration, but he couldn't. For the first time, he saw himself in the story, and it wasn't a flattering reflection. After the session ended, Bradley stayed behind, sitting alone in the empty room. His mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. He had always believed he was a good cop, that his actions were justified, but now he wasn't so sure. Meanwhile, Ethan Miller had begun to find his footing. Under Nathaniel's mentorship, he was slowly learning what it meant to truly serve and protect. He spent time in the community, attending neighborhood meetings and listening to residents' concerns. It wasn't easy and he made mistakes, but he was trying and people noticed. One evening, Ethan and Nathaniel attended a community forum held at a local church. The room was packed with residents eager to voice their frustrations and demand answers. Ethan felt nervous, but Nathaniel's steady presence beside him gave him a sense of purpose. A woman stood up, her voice trembling with anger. "How do we trust you? After everything that's happened, how do we believe that things will actually change?" Nathaniel stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "You have every right to be angry," he said. "You have every right to doubt us. But I can promise you this. I won't stop fighting to make this department what it should be. And I'm not alone. There are people in this room, officers like Ethan Miller, who are just as committed to change. We can't undo the past, but we can build a better future. Together." Ethan looked at the woman, then at the faces in the crowd. Slowly, he stepped up to the microphone. "I can't speak for anyone else, but I can tell you this. I'm listening, and I'm willing to do the work to earn your trust, whatever it takes." The room was silent for a moment, then a few people began to clap. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As weeks turned into months, the changes Nathaniel had implemented began to take root. The precinct was no longer a fortress of unchecked authority. It was becoming part of the community it served. Officers like Ethan thrived under the new leadership, while others, those resistant to change, chose to leave. Bradley Cooper, however, stayed. He completed his training, attended the meetings, and kept his head down. His pride had taken a hit, but something deeper had been shaken loose. One afternoon, Bradley knocked on Nathaniel's office door. "Come in," Nathaniel called. Bradley stepped inside, his hat in his hands. For a moment he didn't speak, just stood there, shifting awkwardly. "Officer Cooper," Nathaniel said, leaning back in his chair. "What can I do for you?" Bradley cleared his throat. I wanted to apologize for everything." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, surprised by the admission. "Go on." Bradley looked down at his hat, his voice low. "I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I always thought I knew what it meant to be a cop. But I was wrong. I didn't see the harm I was doing, and I didn't want to see it. You made me see it." Nathaniel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "It takes courage to admit that, Cooper. More courage than most have." Bradley looked up, his eyes meeting Nathaniel's. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I'm trying to be better." Nathaniel leaned forward, his expression softening. "That's all I've ever asked." The story of Nathaniel Brooks and the Riverside Police Precinct didn't end with a single moment of triumph. Change was slow and often painful, but it was happening. 1 year later, the precinct hosted an open house for the community, inviting residents to meet the officers and learn about the new programs that had been put in place. Ethan stood at the front, talking to a group of children about the importance of honesty and fairness. Nearby, Bradley was answering questions from parents, his demeanor quieter but more genuine than it had ever been. Nathaniel watched from a distance, a small smile playing on his lips. He knew there was still work to be done. There always would be, but moments like this reminded him why he fought so hard. As the sun set over Charleston, Nathaniel walked out of the precinct and into the city he had sworn to protect. He didn't wear his badge as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of his responsibility to the people. Because justice wasn't about uniforms or authority. It was about doing what was right, no matter the cost.